I think so much damage has been done to society. No matter how this is resolved, I think there's been a polarization that we haven't seen before. I think it's gone really ugly. I think there's been a loss of trust in the government and in the police, which can only damage society. It depends on the protest. During peaceful rallies, it's quite moving, really, to see so many people out on the streets all expressing the same things and doing so peacefully and safely. And even though there's hundreds of thousands of people out on the streets, you'll often see families with children, with babies, you'll see elderly people out. So it's quite moving to see so much solidarity. On the other hand, of course, during the more violent protests that we've seen, it is really intense. It's very heated. There's a lot of emotions. It's quite dangerous. You may have to make sure you're geared up for violence from both sides. You don't want to get hit by rubber bullets from the police, but you also don't want to get hit with bricks from protesters either. And in theory, journalists are not the intentional target of either of them, but of course, being in the thick of it, things happen. So it is tense and it is scary. And what's even scarier is that a lot of time they happen in residential areas. So there's normal people living and walking around those areas. A lot of them are getting exposed to tear gas and feel unsafe to leave their homes. The police has become a target because of the way the police have handled the protests. They're accused of using excessive force. They're accused of abusing their power. So at protests or when the police are out, you'll see people shining lights at them. You'll see people heckling them, yelling abuse at them. And of course, more violently now, when there's clashes, you'll see people directly attacking them. You'll see people throwing bricks, throwing petrol bombs now. And even there's been cases of police officers getting doxxed. They're having their private information posted online with information about their family as well. So it's getting pretty nasty. And it's become quite personal on the sides of the protesters and the police. And the police are not necessarily taking it very well, as you can imagine. And there's also things like the Lenin walls, which are spontaneous, non-permanent places in public where people are posting post-it notes or posters or art to express how they feel and their demands. And those are, of course, a peaceful way to protest, and they're all over Hong Kong now. And some of them are quite big. So there's a lot of different ways people are expressing their opinions and wanting to have their voices heard. Of course, there's differing opinions on what methods really work. I think, of course, no one wants to see violence, and it is unfortunate that the protesters are using violence that is probably hurting people, and we know there's some police officers that have been hurt. But at the same time, the police have been criticized by international organizations like Amnesty for escalating the violence, for abusing their power, for using excessive violence. So I think, of course, there's no justification for violence on the part of protesters, but at the same time, I think it's gotten this far because of how the police have managed the situation, how the government hasn't responded to the protesters. The protesters kept getting pushed and pushed until it got to this point. And I think we've come to this violence because of years of the government ignoring what Hong Kong people wanted. I think that's ultimately what happened. I think the police, when it's calm, they are generally polite and professional, but in the heat of the moment, unfortunately, I think they've displayed a lot of highly unprofessional and unacceptable behavior towards the press. They have actively obstructed the press, whether physically by not letting them through or trying to block their cameras, or by even firing pepper spray or tear gas directly at journalists when there were no protesters nearby. I've been tear gassed by the police when there haven't been any protesters nearby. I've been pushed by the police. I've been yelled at by the police. And so there's clearly a lack of discipline and a lack of enforcement within the police force, in which people are not held accountable for their behavior. And I think that's worrying for freedom of the press, and that's worrying for regular civilians as well. I think as a Hong Konger, I think it's important for people to know what's going on. And, you know, I've gotten criticism from all sides, really, for people who think I'm biased against the police, or for people who think I'm not supportive of the protesters. But I, as a journalist, as I'm sure all journalists think, I think ultimately what's important is the truth. And I think the truth is what serves people. I think the truth is what serves the public. And as long as we know the truth, then hopefully, you know, justice will prevail. So it is, as someone from Hong Kong, it is quite intense physically and also intense emotionally and mentally. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. But it's an important story, and I think we're all glad that we're here to tell it, especially for those of us who are from here. I think protesters are grateful for journalists' presence because they believe that showing the world what's happening is in their favor. So they're generally helpful. And it's not just protesters, it's regular people too. I've had people come up to me and offer me food and drink. One time a taxi driver tried to waive my fare while I was on my way to a protest, and it was like over 10 US. I've had, you know, when it's raining, you can actually count on someone offering you an umbrella or a rain jacket. There was one time it started raining and I realized I didn't have anything to protect me or my camera, and I just walked around knowing that someone would offer me something eventually, and they did. Or, you know, if you have to get through a crowd, and the crowds can get really, really dense, especially during the marches, if you just tap on people's shoulders and they see you're a journalist, they'll let you through. So they are definitely aware that the media play an important role in this, and they go out of their way to help you do your job. Though, I mean, saying that, they definitely have also, they do have a history of trying to stop people from taking pictures, especially if they're not clearly a journalist. And I have had experiences where they've tried to physically block me with an umbrella, which I don't think is okay. But generally speaking, I mean, I understand where they're coming from. They don't want their identities shown. But at the same time, you can't stop the press from doing their job. And you can't tell them what to take pictures of or what not to take pictures of. And I think people do generally understand that, but that's something that they seem to be calculating between freedom of the press and potentially having their identities shown. But I would tell them if that's a concern, they should just cover their faces better. I mean, I certainly have encountered pro-Beijing people. They're not uncommon in Hong Kong. They're people I know, they're family members, so I know what they're thinking. And I, of course, do get accused of being biased or being against China. And one time, a woman actually hit me on the street with her bag because she was criticizing the protests and I was taking her photo. So, yeah, there are a lot of, and online, of course, there's a lot of threats. So I've been I get messages on Twitter. Instagram got really bad for me at one point. I actually had to speak to Instagram. I was getting over 1,000 comments on my Instagram from pro-Beijing accounts. I was getting extremely vulgar and aggressive private messages that called me a lot of names and which threatened my family. So I do get a lot of, I don't know if you want to call it criticism from the pro-Beijing camp, but I get a lot of trolls for pro-Beijing. And a lot of them are probably bots or sponsored by the government. I think so much damage has been done to society. No matter how this is resolved, I think there's been a polarization that we haven't seen before. I think it's gone really ugly. I think there's been a loss of trust in the government and in the police, which can only damage society. And I think for many, there's also been a loss of trust in the media. I think it's similar to what we've seen around the world, where people no longer trust the media, accuse organizations of spreading fake news and instead spread disinformation through social media. So I hope that Hong Kong finds peace again. I hope Hong Kong society can find a compromise where everyone's somewhat happy, and I hope the government and the police can regain the public's trust, because otherwise it's going to be a city where no one trusts each other, no one agrees with each other, and I don't think that will be a very nice society to live in.